The silence was wrong. Sarah Caldwell noticed it the moment her hand touched the brass doorknob of the nursery, that peculiar absence of sound that should have been filled with the ordinary chaos of children. No laughter. No crying. No small feet pattering across the pine floorboards. Just the thick, suffocating quiet of the Alabama afternoon, broken only by the lazy drone of flies against the windowpanes. The heat pressed down on everything like a wet wool blanket, making the air itself seem to shimmer and warp. August in the Black Belt had a particular quality of oppression, a heaviness that made even breathing feel like labor. Sarah's corset constricted her ribs as she pushed open the door, her silk dress already damp with perspiration despite the early hour. The nursery swam before her eyes, details emerging slowly through the haze of heat, the 3 small beds arranged along the eastern wall to catch the morning light, the rocking horse in the corner with its painted eyes staring at nothing, the shelf of wooden toys her husband had ordered from Charleston. And in each bed, unnaturally still, lay her children. Margaret, 7 years old and the image of her father with those serious gray eyes, lay on her back with her arms at her sides, positioned with an eerie precision that no sleeping child would maintain. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. Thomas, 5 and always restless, always moving, lay equally motionless, his small mouth hanging open. And baby William, not yet 2, curled in his crib with his thumb near his lips but not quite touching, as if he'd fallen asleep mid-motion. But it was their lips that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Dark purple. Almost black. Stained as if they'd been eating berries, the color spreading beyond the natural line of their mouths like a grotesque parody of cosmetics. Margaret? Sarah's voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. She moved toward her daughter's bed, her legs trembling beneath layers of petticoats. Margaret, darling, wake up. The child didn't stir. Her breathing remained shallow, rapid, her small chest fluttering like a trapped bird. When Sarah touched her daughter's forehead, the skin was burning, slick with fever sweat. That's when she saw Dinah. The girl sat in the corner behind the door, so still that Sarah had missed her entirely upon entering. 14 years old, small-boned and silent, she occupied the straight-backed chair with the rigid posture of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her dark eyes, usually downcast and careful, were fixed on some point in the middle distance, unfocused and empty. Her hands rested in her lap, and her apron pocket bulged with something dark and round. Dinah. Sarah's voice sharpened. Dinah, what's wrong with the children? The girl didn't respond. Didn't even blink. A fly landed on her cheek and walked across her skin, and she made no move to brush it away. Sarah's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She moved to Thomas's bed, shook him gently, then harder. His head lolled to the side, his breathing growing more labored. His lips, too, bore that terrible purple stain. She stumbled to William's crib, her hands shaking as she lifted the baby. His little body was limp, burning with fever, and when she pressed her ear to his chest, his heartbeat thundered far too fast, like hoofbeats racing towards some unseen finish line. What did you do? Sarah whispered, turning back to Dinah. What did you give them? But even as she asked, she knew. The purple stains, the fever, the labored breathing. She'd heard the overseer's wife speak of it once, warning about the deadly plants that grew wild in the woods and along the fence lines. Belladonna. Nightshade. Beautiful and lethal. The room tilted, and Sarah gripped the edge of the crib to steady herself. The flies buzzed louder now, drawn by something she couldn't name, some scent of wrongness that permeated the thick air. Outside, the cotton field stretched white and endless under the merciless sun, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the work songs of the field hands, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that suddenly seemed obscene in their normalcy. How long had they been like this? How long had Dinah sat in that corner, watching? 6 months earlier, February 1848. The auction block in Montgomery stood in a town square like an altar, worn smooth by thousands of feet of those being sold, feet of those doing the buying. Dinah had stood there with her mother's hand clutching hers so tightly it hurt, the only pain she could feel through the numbness that had settled over her like snow. Don't cry, her mother whispered, her voice breaking even as she spoke the words. Don't give them the satisfaction. You hold your head up, you hear me? You hold your head up. But Dinah couldn't hold her head up. Couldn't look at the men who circled them, examining teeth and muscle tone like they were livestock. couldn't meet the eyes of the auctioneer who spoke about them in numbers and percentages, reducing their humanity to profit margins. Richard Caldwell had arrived late, accompanied by his overseer, a thin man named Thaddeus Gaines whose eyes never seemed to blink. Caldwell wore a cream-colored suit despite the mud of early spring, and he moved with the casual authority of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "The girl," he said, pointing at Dinah with the silver handle of his walking stick. "How old?" 14, sir. Strong, healthy. Good teeth. Been trained in housework, can cook, clean, 10 children. Dinah felt her mother's hand tighten impossibly harder. They both knew what was coming. Had known since the moment their previous master died and his estate was liquidated to pay his gambling debts. But knowing didn't make it bearable. "I'll take her," Caldwell said. Separately. That word, separately, fell between them like an axe. Dinah's mother made a sound then, a low keening that came from somewhere deep and primal, and for the first time since they'd been brought to the block, Dinah raised her eyes. She looked at her mother's face, really looked, trying to memorize every line, every feature, knowing she would need to carry this image inside her for whatever remained of her life. "Mama," she whispered. "You be strong," her mother said, tears streaming down her face now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "You are smart. You survive, you hear me? You survive and you remember you're mine. You remember you're loved. Don't you ever forget that, don't you?" The overseer's hand clamped down on Dinah's arm, pulling her away. She stumbled, her legs weak, and the last thing she heard was her mother's voice rising in a wail that seemed to contain every grief the world had ever known. In the wagon that carried her to the Caldwell plantation, Dinah sat among sacks of grain and farm equipment, her arms still aching from where Thaddeus Gaines had branded her with the Caldwell mark, a stylized C that would mark her as property for the rest of her life. The skin was raw, weeping, and with each jolt of the wagon wheels on the rutted road, pain shot through her like lightning. She didn't cry. Her mother had told her not to cry, and so she wouldn't. Instead, she stared at the sky through the gaps in the wagon's canvas cover, watching clouds drift past in shapes that meant nothing, going nowhere she could follow. When they arrived at the plantation, Sarah Caldwell had been waiting on the wide veranda of the main house, her children clustered around her skirts like baby birds. Margaret, Thomas, and little William, who was still learning to walk. They were clean and well-fed, their cheeks rosy with health, their clothes pressed and perfect. "This is Dinah," Sarah said to them, her voice carrying that particular tone of white women instructing their children about the people they owned. "She's going to be helping look after you. You will be kind to her, and she will be obedient and good. Won't you, Dinah?" Dinah had nodded, her eyes on the ground, learning already the posture of invisibility that might keep her safe. "Look at me when I speak to you," Sarah snapped. Dinah raised her eyes. Sarah Caldwell was beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, perfectly arranged features, smooth pale skin, blonde hair arranged in elaborate coils. But her eyes were hard, evaluating, finding Dinah lacking in some fundamental way. "Yes, ma'am," Dinah whispered. "Good. Margaret will show you the nursery. You'll sleep there, on the floor by the door. The children are to be watched at all times. They are to be kept clean, fed, entertained, and educated. If anything happens to them, anything at all, you will be held responsible. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." But Dinah didn't understand. Didn't understand how she was supposed to care for these children when her own mother's arms had just been torn from around her. Didn't understand how she was supposed to be gentle when her arms still burned with the brand that marked her as less than human. Didn't understand how she was supposed to survive in this house that smelled of beeswax and lavender and something else underneath it all, something rotten and sweet, like flowers growing on a grave. Present, August 1848. "Dinah." Sarah's voice rose to a shriek now. "Answer me. What did you give them?" The girl's eyes finally moved, fixing on Sarah with an expression of such profound emptiness that Sarah took an involuntary step backward. It was like looking into a well with no bottom, a darkness that went down and down forever. Slowly, with movements that seemed to belong to someone much older, Dinah reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a handful of berries. They were perfectly round, glossy black, and beautiful in their own terrible way. They sat in her palm like dark pearls, like poison jewels. "Nightshade," Dinah said softly. It was the first word she'd spoken, and her voice was surprisingly clear, almost musical. They were thirsty. I put them in their milk. The berries slipped from her fingers, rolling across the floor like marbles, leaving small purple stains on the pine boards wherever they touched. Sarah's scream, when it came, was primal and terrible. It tore from her throat with such force that she tasted blood, and it echoed through the house, through the grounds, across the cotton fields where the workers stopped their labor and looked toward the big house with expressions of dread and knowing. The flies at the windows rose in a sudden, buzzing cloud, and in the beds, all three children began to convulse. If this story has already gripped you with dread, subscribe to dive deeper into America's darkest historical horrors. Drop a comment below telling us what you think drove her to this act. Dinah first saw the Nightshade on a Tuesday evening in late July, when the heat had broken just enough to allow breathing without feeling like drowning. She'd been sent to fetch water from the well near the slave quarters, a punishment for allowing Margaret to tear her dress while climbing the oak tree in the yard. Never mind that Dinah had warned the child, and had tried to stop her. The dress was ruined, and Sarah Caldwell's justice was swift and arbitrary. "You'll carry water for the field hands tonight," Sarah had said, her voice honey-sweet with malice. "Perhaps that will teach you to be more vigilant with my daughter's things." So Dinah walked the path between the main house and the quarters as the sun bled red across the western sky, her shoulders aching from the day's labor, her stomach cramping with hunger. She'd eaten nothing since dawn, another of Sarah's small cruelties, withholding breakfast for some perceived slight that Dinah couldn't even remember now. The path curved past the old smokehouse, its stone walls crumbling and overgrown, unused since the new one had been built closer to the main house. And there, in the space between the smokehouse and the split-rail fence, growing in a patch of dappled shade, she saw them. The plants stood waist-high, their stems thick and purple-tinged, their leaves broad and dark green. But it was the flowers that caught her eye first, delicate purple bells that seemed to glow in the fading light, each one perfect and alien and beautiful. And among the flowers, already forming on some of the stems, were berries. Green at first, then ripening to a glossy, seductive black that seemed to absorb the twilight rather than reflect it. Dinah stopped walking. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain what drew her to the plants, what made her set down her water buckets and approach them with a strange sense of recognition, as if she'd been looking for them her whole life without knowing it. She knelt before the largest plant, close enough to smell it, a heavy, almost intoxicating sweetness that made her head swim. The berries hung in clusters, each one perfect and round, and when she touched one tentatively, it was cool and smooth beneath her fingertip despite the heat of the day. Beautiful things shouldn't grow here, she thought. Nothing beautiful should exist in this place. But they did. They grew wild and unattended, thriving in the shadows while everything else withered under the Alabama sun. And in that moment, Dinah felt something shift inside her, some fundamental understanding clicking into place like a key turning in a lock. She didn't pick any berries that evening. Just touched them, marveled at them, and then returned to her water carrying with a strange lightness in her chest that she didn't dare examine too closely. That night, lying on her pallet on the nursery floor, listening to the children's soft breathing, she thought about the plants. About their dark beauty. About the way they had seemed to call to her. The beatings had started in April, less than 2 months after her arrival. Thaddeus Gaines was a man who found pleasure in small cruelties. He never struck her hard enough to leave marks that would show, nothing that would diminish her value or raise questions. But his leather strap knew the places that hurt most, the soles of her feet when she was late to wake the children, the palms of her hands when Margaret complained about the way she braided her hair, the backs of her thighs when Thomas spilled his milk and blamed her for not watching closely enough. "You need to learn your place, girl," he would say, his voice flat and emotionless as he administered the punishment. "Mr. Caldwell paid good money for you. You represent an investment. You'll perform your duties properly, or you'll learn what happens to investments that don't appreciate." Dinah learned to absorb the pain without crying out. Learned to stand still and silent while the strap fell, counting the strikes in her head, turning the physical agony into numbers, into something she could contain and control. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Never more than 10. Never enough to truly damage her. But there were other kinds of damage, she was learning. The kind that didn't show on skin. Sarah Caldwell's cruelty was subtler but no less brutal. She wielded Christianity like a weapon, quoting scripture while denying Dinah food, invoking Jesus' name while working her from dawn until long past dark. Every Sunday, she would gather the household slaves, Dinah, the cook Bessie, the house girl Ruth, the stable hand Moses, and read to them from the Bible, always the same passages about servants obeying their masters, about bearing burdens with grace, about the rewards that awaited the faithful in heaven. You should be grateful, Sarah told them, her blue eyes shining with a fervor that looked like madness. Grateful for the opportunity to serve a Christian household. Grateful that we care for your immortal souls when your own people left you in heathen darkness. Grateful for the roof over your heads and the food in your bellies. Dinah wanted to scream that she'd had a roof before, had food before, had her mother's arms and her mother's voice singing her to sleep. Wanted to ask what kind of Christian God sanctioned tearing children from their mother's arms, burning brands into human flesh, beating girls for the crime of existing. But she said nothing. Just kept her eyes lowered and her hands folded and waited for the sermon to end so she could return to the nursery, to her children, because that's how she begun to think of them, despite everything. Her children. Her responsibility. Her burden and her only purpose. She loved them, in a way that made her hate herself. Loved Margaret's serious questions about the world, loved Thomas's sticky-fingered hugs, loved baby William's delighted laughter when she made faces at him. They were innocent of their parents' sins, innocent of the system that enslaved her while elevating them. And that innocence made everything worse. Edmund Caldwell was 17, home from his studies in Charleston for the summer. He was tall and fair-haired like his mother, with his father's calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. He'd noticed Dinah within a week of his return. It started with looks, lingering glances when she served dinner, his gaze following her as she carried William through the halls. Then came the accidental encounters, finding him in the hallway outside the nursery when she went to fetch clean linens, blocking her path in the library when she came to retrieve Margaret's forgotten primer. "You're a pretty little thing," he said one evening in late June, cornering her in the pantry when she'd been sent to fetch preserves for breakfast. "Prettier than most. You know that?" Dinah kept her eyes down, trying to edge past him. "Excuse me, Master Edmund. I need to get back to the children." His hand shot out, gripping her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, these people never left marks where they might be seen, but firm enough to stop her. "I'm talking to you. It's rude not to look at someone when they're talking to you." She raised her eyes. Looked at his face, at the entitled hunger there, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard the stories from the other slave women, whispered warnings about masters' sons and their appetites. Had seen the way Bessie flinched when Richard Caldwell stood too close. Had noticed Ruth's haunted eyes and the way she never spoke about where she went when Mr. Gaines summoned her to his cabin at night. "I'm sorry, Master Edmund," she whispered. He smiled, released her arm, and for a moment she thought she'd escaped. But then his fingers brushed her cheek, traced the line of her jaw, and she understood that this was just beginning. "Good girl," he said softly. "I like obedient girls." That night, Dinah returned to the nightshade plants. Sat among them in the darkness while the moon rose fat and yellow over the cotton fields. She touched the berries again, counted them, and whispered to them like prayers. "I don't know what to do," she told them. Told the darkness. Told whatever gods might listen to the prayers of enslaved girls in Alabama. "I don't know how to survive this." The plants rustled in the night breeze, their purple flowers catching the moonlight. Beautiful and deadly. Poisonous and perfect. An idea, terrible and seductive, began to form in the back of her mind. She pushed it away, horrified by her own thoughts. But it came back, insistent as the heat, patient as the nightshade growing in the shadows. July melted into August, and Edmund's attention intensified. He found more excuses to be near her, to touch her shoulder or her hand or the small of her back. And Dinah began visiting the nightshade every night, drawing comfort from its dark beauty, from the cool smoothness of the berries beneath her fingers. She started picking them on a humid evening when the air felt too thick to breathe. Just a few at first, slipping them into her apron pocket with trembling hands. They were heavier than she expected, solid and real, and carrying them back to the main house felt like carrying secrets, like carrying power. In the kitchen, when Bessie had gone to bed and the house was silent, Dinah crushed 3 berries with the back of a wooden spoon. The juice that ran out was dark purple, almost black, and it stained the cutting board like ink. She stared at it for a long time, her heart hammering, her hands shaking. What was she doing? What was she thinking? But then she remembered Edmund's hands on her yesterday evening, when he'd followed her into the smokehouse, the old one, the abandoned one, the one where she'd first seen the Nightshade. Remembered the weight of him pressing her against the stone wall, his breath hot on her neck, his voice in her ear saying things that made her skin crawl. "Don't tell anyone," he'd whispered when he finally released her. "No one would believe you anyway. And if you cause trouble, my father will sell you south. You know what they do to girls like you in the deep south? You think this is bad? You don't know anything bad." Dinah had stumbled out of the smokehouse with her dress torn, her lip bleeding from where she'd bitten it to keep from screaming, and something broken inside her that she didn't think would ever heal. She'd gone to the Nightshade after. Sat among the plants and wept silently, and they seemed to understand. Seemed to offer her something, not comfort exactly, but solidarity. They, too, were beautiful things forced to exist in an ugly world. They, too, had learned to protect themselves the only way they could. Now, staring at the crushed berries on the cutting board, Dinah made a decision. Not the children, something inside her whispered. "You can't. They're innocent. They're babies." But another voice, colder and more insistent, said, "Nothing is innocent in this house. Nothing survives here without being corrupted. Even you. Especially you." She scraped the crushed berries into a small jar, added a few whole ones, and hid it in the back of the cabinet where Bessie kept the herbs and tonics. Then she cleaned the cutting board until no trace of purple remained, and went upstairs to the nursery where her children slept. Margaret was having a nightmare, whimpering in her sleep. Dinah sat on the edge of her bed, stroked her hair, and hummed a song her mother used to sing, something about rivers and freedom and a far-off shore where the weary could rest. "Shoo," she whispered. "Shoo, baby girl. It's just a dream. Nothing can hurt you here." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Over the next week, Dinah collected more berries. She told herself she was just gathering them, just preparing, not actually planning to use them. The jar in the cabinet grew fuller, the berries piling up like dark pearls, like tiny black hearts. The nightshade plants seemed to multiply, or maybe she was just noticing them more now. They grew everywhere in the shadowed places, behind the quarters, along the fence line, in the spaces between buildings where sunlight rarely reached. It was as if they'd been waiting for her to see them, waiting for her to understand what they offered. She began talking to them in earnest now, whispering her fears and rages into the gathering darkness. The plants never answered, they were just plants, after all, but she felt heard in a way she never felt when speaking to the people around her. The nightshade listened without judgment, without expectation. It simply existed, beautiful and deadly, asking nothing but offering everything. "I loved my mother," she told them one evening, tears streaming down her face. "I loved her so much. And they took her. They took her like she was nothing. Like I was nothing. Like we were just things they could tear apart." The plants rustled in the breeze, their berries gleaming. "I love those children," she whispered. "Margaret and Thomas and little William. I love them, and I hate that I love them. I hate myself for caring about them when they're the reason I'm trapped here. When they'll grow up to be like their parents, like Edmund, like everyone who thinks they own the world and everyone in it." The berries seemed to pulse in the twilight, each one a dark eye watching, understanding. "I don't know what to do," Dinah said again. "I don't know how to survive this. Tell me how to survive this." But the nightshade had no answers. It only offered what it had always offered, beauty and poison, deliverance and damnation, an ending that could look like freedom if you squinted hard enough in the darkness. On the morning of August 15th, Dinah woke with a strange calm settled over her like a shroud. She'd made her decision in the dark hours before dawn, in that liminal space between sleeping and waking where the worst truths hide. She prepared the children's breakfast as usual, porridge with honey for Margaret and Thomas, mashed fruit for William. Sarah inspected the meal with her customary critical eye, found no fault with it, and dismissed Dinah with a wave of her hand. The morning passed in a blur of routine, dressing the children, supervising their lessons, playing their games, reading their stories. Margaret wanted to know why the sky was blue. Thomas wanted to play soldiers. William wanted to be held, his small arms tight around Dinah's neck, his breath warm against her cheek. "Love you, Dinah," he murmured, the way he always did. Something cracked inside her chest, but she didn't let it show on her face. "Love you too, baby," she whispered back. At noon, she prepared their lunch. And in the afternoon, when the heat was at its worst and the children were drowsy and irritable, she brought them their milk. The jar from the cabinet sat heavy in her apron pocket. She'd crushed the berries that morning, early, before anyone else was awake. Had strained the dark juice through cheesecloth into a small vial. Had stood in the kitchen with her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the spoon. Now, in the nursery, she poured 3 cups of milk from the pitcher Bessie had sent up. Sweet milk, cold from the springhouse, the kind the children loved on hot afternoons. Her hands were steady as she added the nightshade juice to each cup. Just a few drops. Just enough. The milk turned faintly purple, but not enough to notice unless you were looking for it. She stirred each cup carefully, watching the poison disappear into the white, becoming invisible, becoming just another part of the children's afternoon routine. Margaret took her cup with a smile. "Thank you, Dinah." Thomas gulped his down immediately, leaving a milk mustache on his upper lip. William needed help holding his cup, his small hands guiding Dinah's larger ones, trusting her completely. She watched them drink. Watched the cups empty. Watched the milk and nightshade disappear into their small, innocent bodies. And felt nothing at all. Outside, the Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields. In the shadows near the old smokehouse, the nightshade plants swayed in a breeze that existed only for them, their berries gleaming like eyes, like promises kept, like prayers answered in the only language that mattered anymore. The language of beautiful, terrible things. Sarah's scream brought the entire household running. Bessie arrived first, her dark hands still dusted with flour from the bread she'd been kneading, her eyes going wide as she took in the scene, the convulsing children, Sarah on her knees beside Margaret's bed, and Dinah sitting motionless in the corner like a carved statue of some forgotten god. "Lord have mercy," Bessie whispered, crossing herself though she'd been Baptist all her life. "Lord Jesus have mercy on us all." Ruth appeared in the doorway, took one look, and backed away, her face draining of color. Moses, the stable hand, stood behind her, his hat clutched in his massive hands, and even from across the room, Dinah could see him putting the pieces together, understanding what had happened and what it meant for all of them. Richard Caldwell's footsteps thundered up the stairs like cannon fire. He burst into the nursery with Thaddeus Gaines at his heels, his face red with exertion and rising fury. But when he saw his children, Margaret's back arching off the bed, Thomas's small body jerking with seizures, William's lips turning blue as his breathing grew shallow and ragged, the color drained from his face like water from a broken vessel. "What in God's name," he started, then stopped, his eyes finding Dinah. "What did you do?" Dinah said nothing. Just looked at him with those hollow eyes, and in that moment, Richard Caldwell felt something he'd never experienced before, genuine fear of one of his own slaves. "Get Dr. Morrison," he barked at Moses. "Ride into town, tell him it's urgent. Tell him," he looked at his children again, and his voice cracked. "Tell him to hurry." Moses ran, his footsteps echoing down the stairs and out the front door. They heard the clatter of hooves moments later, fading into the distance with desperate speed. Sarah had pulled Margaret into her arms, cradling the girl's convulsing body against her chest. "Baby, baby, please," she sobbed. "Please don't leave me. Please, God, please." Margaret's eyes rolled back in her head, showing only whites. Foam gathered at the corners of her purple-stained mouth. Her small hands clawed at her mother's arms, leaving red scratches, but Sarah didn't seem to notice. Thomas had stopped seizing. He lay frighteningly still, his breathing so shallow that his chest barely moved. Richard knelt beside the bed, his hand hovering over his son as if afraid to touch him, afraid that contact would somehow make it more real. And baby William, sweet William who'd called Dinah's name just this morning, who'd wrapped his small arms around her neck and told her he loved her, William was dying fastest of all. His lips were nearly black now, his tiny body racked with tremors, his breathing coming in wet, desperate gasps. "Nightshade," Bessie said quietly from the doorway. She'd seen the berries on the floor, and had recognized them immediately from her grandmother's warnings about the poisonous plants that grew wild. She gave them nightshades. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of horror outward. Richard's head snapped toward Dinah. "Is this true?" Dinah's lips moved, forming words that came out barely above a whisper. They were thirsty. The simplicity of the statement, the absolute flatness of her tone, was more horrifying than any elaborate confession could have been. Thaddeus Gaines moved before Richard could respond, crossing the room in 3 long strides and hauling Dinah up from her chair by her arm. She didn't resist, didn't even seem to notice the bruising grip of his fingers. Just let herself be pulled upright like a rag doll, her eyes still fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. "Get her out of here," Richard said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Get her out of my sight before I kill her myself." Gaines dragged Dinah toward the door. As they passed Sarah, still clutching Margaret's seizing body, the woman looked up with tears streaming down her face, and the expression in her eyes was beyond grief, beyond rage. It was something primal and murderous, a hatred so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "You killed my babies," Sarah whispered. "You killed my babies, you monster, you demon, you." Her words dissolved into incoherent screaming, the kind of sound that would haunt the other slaves' nightmares for years to come. In the quarters, the news spread like wildfire through dry grass. "Dinah poisoned the Caldwell children," Ruth told them, her voice shaking. "All 3 of them. They're dying right now, up in the big house." The small gathering of enslaved people, those who worked in the fields, those who tended the animals, those who lived in the shadows of the plantation, received this news with a complicated silence. No one spoke for a long moment. No one knew what to say. Old Jerome, who'd been enslaved on this land for 40 years, finally broke the silence. "Lord have mercy on that child's soul." "Lord have mercy on all our souls," his wife Clementine added. "You know they won't stop with just her. Master Caldwell's gonna want blood, and he won't care whose." She was right, and they all knew it. Collective punishment was a tool of terror, a way of keeping everyone compliant through shared fear. If one slave stepped out of line, all slaves paid the price. But underneath the fear, underneath the dread of what was coming, there was something else. Something that no one would voice aloud, but that showed in a flicker of eyes, the set of mouths, the way hands clenched and unclenched. Dinah had done what none of them dared to do. Had struck back at their oppressors in the most devastating way possible. And while they grieved for the children, innocent children, after all, part of them, a dark and secret part, felt something uncomfortably close to satisfaction. Moses returned with Dr. Morrison 20 minutes later, but everyone knew it was already too late. The doctor was a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that shook from too much laudanum. He examined the children with growing horror, recognizing the symptoms immediately. "Belladonna poisoning," he confirmed, his voice grim. "Atropa belladonna. There's nothing to be done. The alkaloids are already in their systems, affecting their hearts, their breathing, their nervous systems. I can try to purge them, but at this stage." "Try," Richard commanded. "Do whatever you can." Dr. Morrison administered emetics, tried to force the children to vomit up the poison that was killing them. But it had been hours since they'd drunk the tainted milk, and the nightshade had already done its work. Margaret vomited weakly, bringing up nothing but bile and blood. Thomas couldn't swallow the medicine. And William had stopped breathing altogether. Sarah's scream when the doctor told her youngest was gone transcended human sound. It was something animal, something beyond language, beyond reason. It shattered the afternoon heat like glass, and in the quarters, the enslaved people heard it and knew that someone would pay dearly for that sound. Someone already was paying. In the root cellar beneath the main house, Dinah sat in absolute darkness. Thaddeus Gaines had thrown her down here with instructions to 2 of the largest field hands: "Don't let her out. Don't give her water. Don't speak to her. Mr. Caldwell will decide what to do with her after the children, after we know." But they already knew. Everyone knew. Dinah sat on the dirt floor, her back against the cool stone wall, and felt her mind beginning to fragment like ice breaking up on a river. Time stopped making sense. The darkness was absolute, so complete that she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. And in that darkness, her memories came alive. Her mother's face at the auction block, distorted by tears. "You survive, you hear me? You survive and you remember you're mine." But she hadn't survived, had she? The girl who'd stood on that auction block was already dead, killed by 6 months of systematic cruelty, by Edmund's hands and Sarah's righteousness and the daily grind of being treated as less than human. What sat in this cellar now was just a shell, an echo, a thing that wore Dinah's face but contained only rage and grief and a terrible, yawning emptiness. Margaret's serious gray eyes looking up at her. "Dinah, Why do some people own other people? Mama says it's God's will, but it doesn't seem right. I don't know, baby, Dinah had answered, feeling her heart break a little more. I don't know why anything is the way it is. But she'd known, hadn't she? Had known it wasn't God's will but human cruelty, human greed, human capacity for convincing themselves that other people weren't really people at all. Edmund's breath is hot on her neck in the smokehouse. No one would believe you anyway. And he'd been right. That was the worst part. He'd been absolutely right. Thomas's sticky-fingered hug, his voice muffled against her shoulder. You smell like sunshine, Dinah. William's delighted laughter when she made faces at him, his small hands patting her cheeks. The memories crashed over her in waves, no longer in chronological order, no longer making sense. Past and present bleeding together until she couldn't tell what was real and what was memory and what was nightmare. She'd loved them. She'd really, truly loved those children. And she'd killed them anyway. The realization should have devastated her, should have torn her apart with guilt and grief. But instead, she felt that same hollow calm that had settled over her this morning. As if she'd already died along with them. As if she was already a ghost, just waiting for her body to catch up with her soul. Footsteps above her head. Shouting. Sarah's voice rising and falling in waves of anguish. More footsteps, heavier now. Running. Dinah tilted her head back against the stone wall and closed her eyes, or maybe they were already closed, impossible to tell in this absolute darkness. She thought about the nightshade plants growing in the shadows near the old smokehouse. Wondered if they were blooming right now, their purple flowers opening to catch the afternoon light. Wondered if the berries were ripening, turning from green to that glossy, seductive black. Beautiful things in an ugly world. Deadly things in a place that dealt in death. Above her, she heard a sound that might have been Sarah Caldwell collapsing, might have been furniture being overturned, might have been the whole world coming apart at the seams. And in the darkness, Dinah began to hum the song her mother used to sing. The one about rivers and freedom and a far-off shore where the weary could rest. By sunset, all 3 children were dead. Margaret went first, her seizures finally stopping, her labored breathing easing into silence that was somehow worse than the gasping had been. Thomas followed an hour later, never regaining consciousness, slipping away so quietly that at first no one noticed he was gone. And William, who died hours ago, was finally acknowledged as lost when Dr. Morrison closed his small, staring eyes and pulled the sheet over his face. Sarah had to be sedated with laudanum. She'd torn at her hair, scratched her own face bloody, and tried to throw herself from the second-story window before Richard and Dr. Morrison managed to restrain her. Now she lay in her bedroom, unconscious, her face swollen from crying, her hands clenched into claws even in sleep. Richard sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him, and did calculations in his head. 3 children died. 1 slave who would have to be executed. She was property, yes, but property that had committed murder couldn't be sold, could only be destroyed. The scandal this would cause, the questions it would raise about his household management, his control over his slaves. And Edmund, where was Edmund? He'd disappeared shortly after the children died, riding off toward town without explanation. Richard felt a flash of anger at his eldest son's absence, quickly buried under the weight of everything else. Outside, the sun set in streaks of red and purple, staining the sky the color of the berries that had caused all this death. The slaves moved through their evening routines with unusual quiet, speaking in whispers, avoiding each other's eyes. They all knew what was coming. They'd all seen it before on other plantations, and heard the stories passed from one enslaved person to another in the dark of night. When a slave killed a white person, especially white children, the response was always the same, swift, brutal, and meant to terrify everyone who witnessed it. In the root cellar, Dinah sat in darkness and hummed her mother's song and waited for morning. She knew it would be her last. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these chilling true horror stories. Comment your theories about what happens next. The root cellar smelled of earth and decay, of potatoes rotting in their bins and the sweet sick scent of roots gone soft with age. Dinah had lost track of time in the absolute darkness. It might have been hours or days since they'd thrown her down here. Her throat was parched, her tongue thick and swollen, but she barely noticed. The physical discomfort felt distant, happening to someone else's body. When the cellar door finally opened, spilling lamplight down the wooden steps like liquid gold, Dinah didn't move. Didn't even blink against the sudden brightness that stabbed into her eyes after so long in the dark. Child. The voice was old, weathered, familiar. Judith, who'd been enslaved on this plantation longer than anyone could remember, who'd birthed 3 generations of Caldwell children and buried 2 generations of her own. Child, I brought you water. Dinah's eyes adjusted slowly. Judith descended the stairs with careful, arthritic steps, a tin cup in her gnarled hands. She was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, it was impossible to tell with enslaved people, who aged in ways that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with suffering. They say you killed those babies, Judith said quietly, kneeling beside Dinah with a grunt of pain. Say you fed them nightshade berries. Say you sat and watched them die. Dinah's lips moved, her voice a cracked whisper. I gave them milk. Milk with poison in it. Yes. Judith held the cup to Dinah's lips, helped her drink. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most beautiful thing Dinah had ever experienced. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin, and when the cup was empty, she finally met Judith's eyes. Do you hate me? Dinah asked. Judith was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying Dinah's face in the lamplight. I loved those children, she said finally. Helped birth every one of them. Held them when they were crying babies, taught them their first words. Margaret used to climb into my lap and ask me to tell her stories about Africa, even though I was born right here in Alabama, just like my mama before me. Tears slid down Dinah's cheeks, the first she'd cried since it happened. I loved them too. I know you did, child. I saw it. That's what makes it so terrible. Judith shifted, her old bones creaking, and settled more comfortably on the dirt floor beside Dinah. Tell me what happened. Tell me what brought you to this. And Dinah spoke. The words came out in fragments, in broken pieces that didn't quite fit together, like poetry written by someone whose mind had shattered and reassembled wrong. There was a night, Dinah whispered, her voice distant and dreamy. July. Hot. So hot the air felt like it was burning. Mrs. Sarah sent me to the smokehouse, the old one, not the new one, to fetch the ham for dinner. And Edmund was there. Judith's hand found Dinah's, squeezed gently. She said nothing, just listened. He'd been watching me for weeks. Follow me. Touching me when no one was looking. Little touches at first, then bolder. I knew what was coming. We all know what's coming, don't we? We learn it young, learn to see that look in their eyes. The smokehouse stone was rough against her back, scraping through the thin fabric of her dress. Edmund's hands were everywhere, tearing, bruising. His breath smelled of whiskey and tobacco. Please, she'd whispered. Please, Master Edmund, don't. Shoo, he'd said, almost gently, as if soothing a frightened animal. It'll be easier if you don't fight. He took what he wanted, Dinah said flatly. And when he was done, he straightened his clothes and told me to clean myself up. Told me no one would believe me if I told. Told me I should be grateful it was him and not someone rough, someone who'd really hurt me. Judith made a sound low in her throat, somewhere between a moan and a prayer. I went to Mrs. Sarah the next morning, Dinah continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality, as if reciting a dark nursery rhyme. Thought maybe she'd help. Thought maybe a woman would understand. I showed her the bruises on my arms, the torn dress. Told her what her son had done. Sarah Caldwell had looked at her with ice in her eyes. You dare come to me with these lies? You dare try to besmirch my son's reputation with your filthy accusations? It's not a lie, ma'am. Please, The slap had come so fast Dinah hadn't seen it coming. Sarah's ring had cut her cheek, and she'd tasted blood. You tempted him, Sarah hissed. Walking around this house with your loose ways, your shameful body. You're fortunate he's a gentleman who stopped when he'd had his fill. You're fortunate I don't have you whipped raw for your impudence. She locked me in the nursery for 3 days, Dinah said. No food. Only water. Said I needed to learn to control my sinful nature, needed to pray for forgiveness for what I'd done to her son. And the children, Margaret, Thomas, William, they didn't understand why I was crying. Margaret brought me pieces of her bread, sneaking it to me when her mother wasn't looking. Sweet baby. Sweet, innocent baby. Judith's thumb traced circles on the back of Dinah's hand. Still she said nothing, just bore witness. And Mr. Richard, Dinah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, Mr. Richard. He was there when I dressed Margaret one morning, a week after Edmund. I was helping her with her buttons, and she moved suddenly, and I flinched. Just flinched, because my body had learned to expect pain. And he saw it. Saw me flinch away from his daughter's innocent movement. Richard Caldwell had grabbed her arm, spun her around. What's wrong with you? Why are you acting like a skittish horse? Nothing, sir. I'm sorry, sir. His eyes had narrowed. Have you been shirking your duties? Neglecting my children? No, sir, I swear. The blow had knocked her to the floor. Margaret screamed. Richard had stood over Dinah, his face red with anger at her presumption, her existence, her reminder that not everything in his perfect world ran smoothly. Learn your place, he'd said coldly. Or I'll teach it to you. They broke me, Dinah whispered to Judith, to the darkness, to whatever God still listened to the prayers of enslaved girls. Piece by piece, they broke me. And then they expected me to love their children, to care for them, to raise them gentle and kind. Expected me to teach them goodness while showing me only cruelty. So you gave them the nightshade, Judith said softly. It wasn't a question. So I gave them the nightshade, Dinah agreed. Beautiful berries. Shiny and black and perfect. The children thought it was special, thought it was something sweet I'd made just for them. Margaret asked me what made the milk taste different, and I told her it was love. And it was, in a way. I loved them enough to end it quickly, loved them enough to spare them from growing up to be their parents. That's not love, child. Then what is it? Dinah's voice rose, cracking. What do you call it when you care for someone so deeply that watching them become monsters is unbearable? What do you call it when the only mercy you can offer is death? Judith had no answer. The lamplight flickered, sending shadows dancing across the stone walls like restless spirits. I think about my mama, Dinah continued, her voice dropping back to a whisper. Wonder what she'd think of what I've done. She told me to survive, told me to be strong. But I couldn't, Judith. I couldn't survive what they made me into. So I took them with me. Took the children down into the dark with me, where at least they'll never have to buy and sell and break people like their parents did. They were babies, Judith said, and for the first time, her voice held judgment. They were innocent babies who never hurt anyone. No one is innocent in this house, Dinah replied. No one survives here without blood on their hands. Even you, Judith. Even you helped raise the Caldwells, helped make them into what they are. Even if you are part of this. The words hung between them like an accusation, like a truth too terrible to acknowledge but too honest to deny. Above ground, in the main house, Sarah Caldwell walked the halls like a ghost herself. Dr. Morrison had left her enough laudanum to sleep for a week, but she'd stopped taking it after the first day. She wanted to feel the pain, needed to feel it, because feeling pain meant her children had been real, had existed, had mattered. Without the pain, they might as well have been dreams. She saw them everywhere. Margaret standing at the top of the stairs, her gray eyes serious and questioning. Thomas ran past the parlor door, his laughter echoing down the hallway. William in the nursery, reaching up with his small hands, wanting to be held. But when she moved toward them, they vanished like smoke. And their lips were always stained that terrible purple-black, the color of nightshade, the color of poison, the color of her own failure to protect them. Mama, Margaret whispered from the shadows. Mama, why didn't you save us? I tried, Sarah sobbed, reaching toward the empty air where her daughter's ghost had stood. I tried, baby. I didn't know. I didn't see. Several of the women produced fans and began waving them frantically, but it only seemed to agitate the flies further. They landed on faces, on hands, on the judge's papers, their buzzing growing to a roar that made it hard to think. State your case, Mr. Caldwell, Judge Whitmore said, raising his voice over the insects. Richard stood, composed despite the heat and the flies. He prepared his testimony carefully, editing out anything that might reflect poorly on his household management. On the afternoon of August 15th, my wife discovered our 3 children in the nursery, poisoned by belladonna administered by this slave. She confessed to the act immediately, showing no remorse, no human feeling whatsoever. The children suffered terribly before dying. Dr. Morrison can attest to the brutality of their deaths. Dr. Morrison stood when called, his hands trembling more than usual. The children exhibited classic symptoms of atropine poisoning. Dilated pupils, fever, convulsions, respiratory failure. There was nothing I could do. The poison, his voice cracked. The poison was already too far advanced in their systems. And the accused confessed? Judge Whitmore asked, though everyone knew the answer. She told my wife she put nightshade berries in their afternoon milk, Richard confirmed. She sat and watched them die without raising an alarm, without calling for help. It was deliberate. It was murder. The word hung in the stifling air, murder. As if the legal term applied to slaves the same way it applied to white people. As if Dinah possessed the agency and personhood required for such a charge, rather than being property that had malfunctioned, an investment that had turned destructive. Mrs. Caldwell, the judge said gently. Would you like to speak? Sarah rose with theatrical dignity, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. She'd been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it in her mind during the long, ghost-haunted nights. This was her chance to give voice to her grief, to transform her children's deaths into a morality play with clear villains and victims. That girl, she began, her voice trembling with controlled emotion, came into our Christian home 6 months ago. We treated her with kindness, with charity. We gave her meaningful work, trusted her with our most precious treasures, our babies. We fed her from our own table, clothed her, and taught her to read scripture. This was a lie. Dinah had never been taught to read, had never eaten from the Caldwell table. But no one contradicted Sarah. And how did she repay our Christian generosity? With treachery. With murder. With the slaughter of innocents. Sarah's voice rose, taking on a fevered pitch. She is a demon child, a serpent we welcomed into our Eden. She looked at my babies with those dead eyes and fed them poison like she was giving them candy. Sarah's voice broke. She swayed, and the woman beside her, Mrs. Pemberton from the neighboring plantation, caught her elbow to steady her. My Margaret, Sarah sobbed. My sweet Margaret who never hurt anyone. My Thomas, my baby William. She took them from me. She murdered them in cold blood, and she sat there and watched them die. What kind of creature does such a thing? What kind of monster? A monster you created, Dinah said quietly. The room froze. Every eye turned to her. She'd stood silent and still throughout the proceedings, giving no sign she was even listening. But now she'd spoken, and her voice, calm, clear, utterly composed, cut through Sarah's theatrical grief like a knife through silk. Judge Whitmore's face reddened. The accused will remain silent unless. I loved those children, Dinah continued, as if he hadn't spoken. Her eyes, finally, focused on the room, on the assembled faces of the people who'd gathered to condemn her. I loved them, and that's what made it unbearable. The statement landed like a physical blow. Several people gasped. Mrs. Pemberton's fan clattered to the floor. Even Judge Whitmore seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Because how could you reconcile those two ideas? Love and murder. Tenderness and poison. The care she'd given those children for 6 months, the gentle hands that had dressed them, fed them, comforted them, and the same hands that had crushed nightshade berries into their milk. It was too complex, too disturbing. It required acknowledging that Dinah was capable of love, which meant acknowledging she was human, which meant acknowledging that the system had driven a human being to commit an inhuman act. And that acknowledgement would crack the foundation of everything they'd built their lives upon. Silence her, someone shouted from the back. Don't let her say such blasphemy. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. I loved those children, and that's what made it unbearable. Edmund Caldwell, still staring at the floor, had gone paper white. His hands gripped his knees so tightly they shook. The accused, Judge Whitmore said loudly, trying to regain control of the room, has confessed to the deliberate poisoning of 3 children. The evidence is overwhelming. The confession is clear. There can be only one verdict. But before he could pronounce it, Reverend Cotton stood. He was a thin, ascetic man who'd been silent until now, watching the proceedings with an expression that might have been disgust or might have been fascination, it was hard to tell. If I may, he said quietly. I believe we should hear why she did this terrible thing. For the sake of our immortal souls, we should understand what drives such depravity. No, Richard said sharply. There's no need to. I think the good Reverend has a point, Judge Whitmore interrupted, seeing an opportunity to add more theater to the proceedings. Girl, why did you murder the Caldwell children? Dinah looked at Edmund. Really looked at him, her eyes boring into the side of his face until he had no choice but to meet her gaze. When he finally did, she saw everything she needed to see there, guilt, shame, fear, and underneath it all, the same entitled cruelty that had driven him to the smokehouse that July night. Ask your son, she said softly. The room erupted. Richard lunged toward Dinah, only to be restrained by Thaddeus Gaines. Sarah began screaming. Edmund stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor. How dare you? Richard roared. How dare you try to besmirch my family's name with your lies? She's lying, Edmund said, his voice high and panicked. Father, she's a liar, she's trying to. I'm not lying, Dinah said, still in that same quiet, matter-of-fact tone. And everyone in this room knows it. Mrs. Sarah knows it. She knew what her son did to me, and she punished me for it. Called me a temptress. Locked me in the nursery for 3 days without food. Told me I'd corrupted her precious boy with my wickedness. Sarah's screaming had dissolved into incoherent sobbing. She clawed at her own face, leaving red scratches on her cheeks. Your son raped me in the smokehouse, Dinah continued, her voice never rising, never wavering. And when I went to his mother for help, she blamed me. Your overseer beat me for minor infractions until I learned to move like a ghost, to make myself invisible. Your husband struck me for flinching when Margaret moved too quickly. You all created the monster you're so eager to destroy. You made me into this. Lies, someone shouted. Devil's tongue. Shut her mouth. But Judge Whitmore held up his hand, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he studied Dinah, then looked at Edmund's pale, guilty face, then at Sarah's theatrical grief that had suddenly become something more genuine and terrible, the grief of a woman confronting truths she'd worked hard to bury. It doesn't matter, the judge said finally. Even if every word she speaks is true, which I do not concede, it doesn't matter. She is property. Property that malfunctioned. Property that must be destroyed to preserve order and discourage further insurrection. He'd said the quiet part loud, acknowledged that this had never been about justice, only about maintaining the system through terror. The verdict is guilty, he announced. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. May God have mercy on her soul, if indeed such creatures possess souls at all. The flies rose in a sudden cloud, buzzing frantically around the judge's head. He swatted at them, his composure finally cracking. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained cloudless. The air pressure seemed to drop, making everyone's ears pop simultaneously. And Dinah smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, or a victorious one. It was something sadder and stranger, the smile of someone who'd finally reached the end of a long, terrible journey and was relieved to see it finished. May I make one request? She asked. Judge Whitmore hesitated, then nodded warily. I'd like to be hanged near the old smokehouse. Where the nightshade grows. The request was so odd, so specific, that no one knew how to respond. Richard started to object, then stopped, too exhausted by the proceedings to care about such a small detail. Very well, the judge said. Sheriff, see to it that a gallows is erected near the old smokehouse. The execution will take place at dawn. They led Dinah away, back to the root cellar for her final night on earth. As she passed Edmund, she stopped, forcing the men holding her to stop as well. I hope you hear their voices, she whispered to him. Every night for the rest of your life. I hope you hear Margaret asking you why, hear Thomas crying, hear William calling your name. I hope they haunt you the way they'll haunt me. Edmund's face crumpled. He looked, suddenly, like the boy he was, 17 years old and broken by the weight of what he'd set in motion. Then Dinah was gone, dragged back down into the darkness, and the assembled crowd began to disperse, eager to escape the oppressive heat and the buzzing flies and the uncomfortable truths that had been spoken in that suffocating room. Sarah remained in her chair, rocking back and forth, her hands pressed over her ears as if trying to block out voices only she could hear. "Mama," Margaret's ghost whispered from the corner. "Mama, she loved us." And the nightshade, growing wild near the old smokehouse, spread its roots deeper into the Alabama soil, preparing to receive another body, another offering, another victim of the system that poisoned everything it touched. Dawn came soft and pink over the Alabama plantation, beautiful in the way that cruel things often are. The air was cool for the first time in weeks, carrying the scent of dew-wet earth and something else, something sweet and poisonous that seemed to rise from the ground itself. They brought Dinah out of the root cellar as the first light touched the eastern sky. She walked between Thaddeus Gaines and the sheriff with steady steps, her bare feet leaving prints in the damp grass. She'd been given water but no food, and her body felt light, insubstantial, as if she might float away at any moment. The gallows stood near the old smokehouse, exactly as she'd requested. It was a crude thing, hastily constructed from rough timber, but functional. The noose hung from the crossbeam like a question mark, swaying gently in the morning breeze. And all around the smokehouse, the nightshade had bloomed. They'd been there all along, of course, but overnight they seemed to have multiplied impossibly. The plants stood thick and lush, their stems heavy with purple bell-shaped flowers that caught the dawn light and seemed to glow from within. And among the flowers, the berries, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, gleamed like dark jewels, like watching eyes, like promises kept. Dinah saw them and smiled. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour. Richard Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. Sarah had been left at the house, too deep in her laudanum haze and grief madness to attend. But Edmund was there, pale and hollow-eyed, standing as far from the gallows as he could while still being present. The other enslaved people from the plantation had been ordered to attend, a lesson, Richard had said, in what happened to those who stepped out of line. Judith stood among them, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. Reverend Cotton climbed onto the platform beside the gallows, his Bible clutched in his thin hands. "Do you wish to make a confession?" he asked Dinah as they positioned her beneath the noose. "To ask God's forgiveness before you meet your Maker?" Dinah looked at him with those distant, knowing eyes. "I already confessed," she said softly. "And I doubt your God listens to girls like me." "God listens to all who—" "If he listened," Dinah interrupted, "he would have heard me screaming in that smokehouse. He would have heard my mother crying on the auction block. He would have heard every prayer whispered by every person you've enslaved, every plea for mercy, every desperate bargain offered to the sky." She paused, her eyes moving to the nightshade plants. "Your God is deaf." But the nightshade was heard. The nightshade answered. Reverend Cotton stepped back, making the sign of the cross as if warding off evil. The sheriff placed the noose around Dinah's neck. The rope was rough against her skin, scratching, tightening. She could feel her pulse thundering in her throat, and could feel her body preparing for the violence to come. But her mind remained calm, focused on the purple flowers swaying in the breeze. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, his hand on the lever that would drop the platform beneath her feet. Dinah looked out at the assembled crowd. At Richard Caldwell with his stone face and guilty conscience. At Edmund with his cowardice written in every line of his body. The enslaved people were forced to witness this theater of terror. At Judith, who tried to understand, who'd listened in the darkness. "The nightshade blooms," Dinah said clearly. "And it will keep blooming long after you've all forgotten my name. It will bloom in the shadows and the secret places, and everyone who sees it will remember, somewhere deep in their bones, what you made me into. What this place makes of everyone who passes through it." Richard nodded to the sheriff. The lever pulled. The platform dropped. But Dinah's eyes never left the nightshade plants. As the rope caught and her body jerked, as her neck snapped with a sound like breaking branches, her gaze remained fixed on those beautiful, deadly flowers. And in that final moment, as the light began to fade from her eyes, she could have sworn she saw them reaching toward her, their stems extending like welcoming arms, their berries glistening with something that looked almost like tears. Her face, in death, held a strange peace. Not the peace of the righteous, but the peace of the exhausted finally allowed to rest. The peace of someone who'd carried an unbearable weight and been permitted, at last, to set it down. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the scene, to return to their orderly lives and pretend this had been justice rather than murder. But the enslaved people remained a moment longer, bearing witness, remembering, adding Dinah's story to the long, terrible catalogue of stories they carried. Judith approached the gallows, looked up at the small body swaying gently in the morning breeze. "Rest now, child," she whispered. "Rest, and may whatever comes after be kinder than what came before." Then she, too, turned away, leaving Dinah to the nightshade and the rising sun. The nightshade spread. Within a week, it had colonized the entire area around the old smokehouse. Within 2 weeks, it appeared along the fence lines, in the spaces between the slave quarters, creeping up the side of the barn. Within a month, it had invaded the kitchen garden, choking out the vegetables, twining around the bean poles, its purple flowers blooming with unnatural vigor. The field hands tried to pull it up, but it grew back overnight, faster and thicker than before. Thaddeus Gaines ordered controlled burns, but the nightshade's roots went too deep, and it returned from the ashes like a resurrection. And everywhere it grew, it seemed to watch. The berries caught the light at odd angles, gleaming like eyes, and more than one person swore they saw shapes moving among the plants at twilight, a small figure in a stained dress, tending her dark garden. Sarah Caldwell's madness deepened into something beyond laudanum's reach. She stopped sleeping, certain that if she closed her eyes, she'd see her children standing at the foot of her bed, their lips stained purple, their eyes accusing. She stopped eating, convinced that everything tasted bitter, that Dinah had poisoned not just the children but the entire plantation, tainting every meal with the ghost of Nightshade. "Do you taste it?" she'd ask Richard at dinner, pushing her plate away untouched. "That bitterness? That's her. That's Dinah. She's in the food, in the water, in the air we breathe." "You need to rest," Richard would say, but his own hands trembled when he brought his fork to his mouth, and he too had begun to notice a strange aftertaste in everything. The nursery remained locked. But Sarah swore she heard singing coming from behind the closed door, children's voices rising and falling in melodies that had no earthly source. She'd press her ear to the wood and weep, listening to her babies sing songs about rivers and freedom and far-off shores where the weary could rest. Sometimes, late at night, she'd find purple stains on her hands. Stains that wouldn't wash off, that seemed to seep up from beneath her skin like stigmata. She'd scrub until her palms bled, but the color remained, dark and accusatory. Edmund left for Charleston 3 weeks after the hanging. He told his father he was returning to his studies early, but everyone knew the truth. He couldn't bear the plantation anymore, couldn't bear the nightshade spreading like judgment, couldn't bear the weight of what he'd set in motion. He never returned. Years later, Richard would receive word that Edmund had died in a boarding house fire, drunk and alone, his last words reportedly something about purple flowers and a girl's voice singing in the darkness. The plantation began to fail. The cotton crop withered that year, plagued by insects and blight despite perfect growing conditions. The next year was worse. The enslaved people grew restless, whispered of curses and hauntings, and 3 families ran for freedom under cover of darkness, something that had never happened on the Caldwell plantation before. Richard tried to sell Dinah's hanging as a cautionary tale, as proof of his firm hand and unwillingness to tolerate insurrection. But the neighboring planters looked at his declining yields, his mad wife, his escaped slaves, and saw only failure. Saw a man who'd lost control, whose plantation was rotting from the inside out. The nightshade continued to spread. It climbed the pillars of the main house, its vines thick as a man's wrist, its flowers blooming in profusion. It crept through the cotton fields, strangling the plants, turning white fields purple. It grew in the cemetery where the 3 children were buried, twining around their headstones like mourners who would never leave. And at night, when the moon was full, people swore they saw her, a small figure moving through the nightshade, her hands gentle as she tended the plants, her voice humming songs about freedom and rivers and rest. Judith saw her once, clear as day, standing among the purple flowers near the old smokehouse. The girl looked at her with those hollow eyes and smiled, not the terrible smile of the trial, but something softer, sadder. "I'm sorry," Judith whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it." But Dinah just shook her head and faded back into the flowers, as if to say there was nothing to forgive, that it had all been inevitable from the moment she stood on that auction block, that some stories can only end one way. By 1850, the Caldwell plantation stood abandoned. Richard had sold what slaves he could, liquidated his assets, and moved with Sarah to Montgomery, hoping distance would cure her madness. It didn't. She died in an asylum 2 years later, still insisting she could taste poison in everything, still hearing children's voices in empty rooms. Richard lived longer, but not happily. He remarried, tried to start fresh, but the nightmares followed him. Every night, he dreamed of a 14-year-old girl with hollow eyes and hands full of dark berries, offering them to him like communion. The plantation itself returned to wilderness. The main house's windows shattered, its roof collapsed, its proud columns crumbled. The slave quarters rotted and fell. The cotton fields went to weeds and wild grass. But the nightshade thrived. It spread across every inch of the property, transforming the plantation into a dark, beautiful garden. The plants grew taller than any natural nightshade should grow, their stems thick as small trees, their flowers blooming year-round despite the seasons. And the berries hung in heavy clusters, gleaming like obsidian, like promises, like memories that refused to fade. Decades later, 1890, 42 years after Dinah's death, a journalist from Montgomery came to write about Alabama's abandoned plantations, those monuments to a system that had finally, bloodily, collapsed. He stood in what had once been the Caldwell plantation and marveled at the nightshade forest that had swallowed it. The plants stood 12 feet tall in places, their canopy so thick it blocked out the sun, creating a twilight world beneath. What happened here? He asked his guide, an old freedman who'd been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. The man, it was Moses, aged now but still strong, looked at the nightshade with something like reverence. A girl happened, he said quietly. A girl who loved some children so much it broke her. A girl who was broken so completely she broke the world right back. I heard the Caldwells abandoned this place. Bad luck, they said. Wasn't luck. Moses reached out, touched one of the nightshade berries gently. It was warm beneath his fingers, pulsing almost, as if it held a heartbeat. Was justice? Or maybe revenge? It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. The journalist wanted to ask more, but something about the nightshade forest unnerved him. The way the berries caught the light. The way the silence felt populated, as if invisible watchers stood among the purple flowers. The way the air tasted faintly bitter, like poison or grief. They left quickly, and the journalist never wrote his article. Some stories, he decided, were too dark, too complex, too honest about the horrors that genteel society preferred to forget. But the nightshade remained. It blooms there still, in what was once the Caldwell plantation, spreading a little further each year. The berries gleam like eyes in the Alabama sun, watching, remembering, bearing witness to what happened when the crushing weight of slavery met the human capacity for love and rage and desperate, terrible choices. Local people avoid the place. They tell their children stories about the ghost girl who tends the poison garden, about the 3 white children she murdered, about the system that murdered her first. They argue about whether she was a victim or monster, whether her act was evil or inevitable, whether anyone in that house, slave or master, was truly innocent. But the nightshade doesn't argue. It simply grows, beautiful and deadly, transforming horror into flowers, turning pain into dark berries that hold the story in their glossy black surfaces. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind moves through the purple blooms, you can almost hear it, a girl's voice, singing a song about rivers and freedom and a far-off shore where the weary finally rest. Where even the broken can bloom. If this story left you disturbed and wanting more macabre historical horror, hit that subscribe button. Tell us in the comments, was she a victim, a monster, or both?